Hey everyone, today we're taking a look back into DBD's past and discussing some of the worst states of powers in the game's history. Let's get into it. Freddy's old power was significantly different upon release, and was pretty bad, particularly after its initial nerf round. For starters, Freddy was unable to damage anyone who wasn't in the dream world. That alone I think makes his power pretty dreadful. This is further considering that to get out of the dream world, it's as easy as failing a skill check or locating a teammate to snap their fingers at you. The one upside of this, however, was that as a survivor, you wouldn't be able to see Freddy at all if you were awake, but only hear a lullaby. This did generally allow you to get quite close as Freddy before pulling someone into the dream world. However, after you did pull them in, they still had time to react before you could actually hit them. Freddy also didn't have access to any other abilities like he does now with his snares or pallets, which in the current day make up the majority of his power. He also couldn't teleport to generators, which is a genuinely decent map control tool he has now. Back then though, he had nothing aside the dream world and his ability to pull survivors in manually. Doing so would also cause a 3-second long hindered type effect where you would become briefly slower. His power overall therefore was pretty terrible. The one upside you did get, and the benefit of having a survivor in the dream world, was that they would suffer from a sizable 50% reduction to action speeds. However, remember that you had to manually pull everyone into the dream world, and as soon as you stop chasing a survivor who's asleep, they're probably going to go break out straight away, which makes this whole aspect fall flat. The other downside, and one that was actually quite strong and meaningful, was that if you were outside of his terror radius when asleep, your aura was visible to him after being out of it for 10 seconds. Originally Freddy's terror radius was 16 meters, but was later nerfed to 24 meters. This at least gave the chance to locate survivors if you'd lost them, and could maybe give you some decent information on where other survivors were, or which generators were being focused. But let's be real, it's by no means strong in the hands of this Freddy, who relied solely on his clawed glove. His power was basically the ability to make survivors vulnerable to attacks, which is a basic thing every other character has at base. Trickster had a lot against him when he first released, and the state he released in was far from how it is today. The main and largest weakness of his power back then was the need for 8 lacerations instead of the current 6 lacerations needed to cause damage with the blades. This was somewhat remedied by the fact that he had a base of 60 blades back then, but it still undoubtedly felt very bad. There were a bunch of number differences also that generally made him weaker. His original movement speed when throwing was much slower, being 3.68 meters per second, which is the same walk speed as when you're carrying a survivor. However, this number was only during the beginning of his throws. It would actually get slower the longer you threw, reducing down to as little as 2.68 meters per second. This is 67% of the movement speed of survivors, making you a whole third slower than them. This would make it particularly hard when in chase to round corners and get hits, with the old version requiring 8 blades too. You can imagine how frustrating this was. Main Event also had a little slower movement speed, however the main issue with Main Event was that you weren't able to hold it for very long. Originally you would have a tiny 10-second window to choose to use Main Event or not, compared to the current 30 seconds. It really was almost an inconsequential ability, as you'd almost never get a good chance to use it, due to the tiny activation window. Bubba is fairly widely known as one of the worst release characters, having the majority of his power being ripped from Billy, with his add-ons literally being shared with Billy, despite their power similarities beginning and ending with a chainsaw. Bubba's power originally worked a little differently. His chainsaw didn't have charges, and in order to use it you had to charge the bar up to full and release it. This was one part of his power I personally really hated, as it was a super annoying way to activate it, instead of it immediately beginning a sweep when filling the bar. Due to the lack of charges, the chainsaw sweep would also last a very short time. I believe it lasted for the duration of one current token chainsaw sweep, which is really not much considering the abundance of pallets and strong windows back then. He also still had the tantrum mechanic, although to a less significant degree than his current state, as his sweeps were much shorter. Bubba was, and likely will always be, the most barebones character they ever add to the game, with him having reused add-ons, many of which applied awfully to his power, and also having a nerfed version of Billy's far superior chainsaw. He was literally the worst version of the character who was based off of him, which is kind of sad. I don't even have too much to say because there's literally not much to say about him, as there was so little to him back then, even less than there is now. Hag, interestingly, upon release was quite weak. To start off, and one huge downside of her and other trap characters at the time was that traps took an age to set. It's actually quite painful watching old Hag gameplay, as the animation is so unbelievably slow. To pair with this, she had an incredibly short teleportation range, being just 32 meters. After teleporting, she would also suffer from being fixed in position for around a second, disallowing the instant pickup and chase that she benefits from now, where a teleport often means a guaranteed hit. Back then, it was teleport to get close to the survivor. Another huge downside, and one that would honestly help to counter her slugging potential nowadays, is that survivors used to be able to trigger traps when in the dying state, which is honestly quite strong, and if they were left on the ground, it would leave them able to completely clear out a trapped area. She also didn't have the weakness of survivors being able to crouch over traps. There was no way to avoid a trap. If you hit it or were near it, it would trigger, which is kind of nice in one way, but reasonably didn't do much. Back then, I suppose she did also have the downside of survivors not being able to scratch the traps away like they can now, so it wasn't all bad. Much like some of the other characters we've discussed here, Hag also suffered from having not the best add-ons to pair with her power. Her add-ons often had these odd downsides that many of the early game add-ons had. For example, original Cracked Turtle Egg would extend the duration a phantasm trap remained visible after being triggered. However, it decided to have a downside which reduced her teleportation distance by 50%, which is insanely bad. That makes her teleport range 16 meters. Most of the add-ons were like this. They'd provide an upside, but then nerf her power in some other way. It was truly very weird. Dried Cicada increases the teleportation distance, however, increases the time it takes to set traps. Stuff like that. And this was all throughout her green and yellow add-ons, often with browns being the only ones to just give a buff and not have a negative downside. Wraith early on was probably the weakest of the original three, having little to make him stand out. Trapper had the ability to close off areas, and his traps back then were quite strong and unfair. Billy, of course, had his insta-down and his speed. Wraith was kind of in the middle, and a bit left out as an M1 character, who had to suffer the most against old survivor items and infinites and such. The worst part about Wraith, and his main benefit of stealth, was that this stealth wasn't particularly stealthy. For one, and one thing I just kind of find funny, is that he'd originally disturb crows even when cloaked. This is such a small thing, but I do feel like it really represents the overall tone of his character back then. A stealth character who isn't stealthy. His invisibility was generally less effective and easier to see, and he was also far louder with his breathing and such. His first patch is literally just removing stuff like this to make him actually stealthy. Another big downside to his lack of stealth was that he'd spawn in not cloaked, where now you have the benefit of spawning in cloaked, able to instantly move and find someone whilst being stealthy and cloaked. Back then you'd spawn in and have to manually cloak yourself at the start of the game. It's worth mentioning too that cloaking back then was something that survivors could hear map wide, which meant they'd instantly know it was Wraith when loading into a match, if you chose to immediately cloak. When uncloaking, the bell would also sound at the start of the animation, compared to now where it occurs much deeper in, to allow for a better chance at a surprise attack. As soon as you pressed it, you'd hear the ringing. Cloaking and uncloaking were also both slower, and the movement speed you had whilst ringing the bell was also slower, making you even less stealthy. Yeah, old Wraith was pretty bad. The weaknesses aren't over yet. Wraith back then did still have Lightburn, and it was far worse. When Lightburn was removed recently, it was activatable after a survivor shined a flashlight onto Wraith for a duration of 2 seconds. Back then, it was just 1 second. Finally, a really big downside I think, and maybe the largest, is that Wraith wasn't actually able to break pallets, generators, or search lockers when he was cloaked, forcing you to come out of your power and spend most of your time simply chasing. Alright, well, on that note, that's gonna do it. What's the worst state of a power you can remember? let me know down below. Thanks, and goodbye.